I would like to invite Dr. Naader to lay out the vision and the context and the purposes and the goals of this International Symposium on Consciousness and its Applications, on the fundamental role of consciousness in solving the world's problems. Dr. Naader will address us on these points. He will provide a direction to this conference. And I should say these conferences, these symposia of this week, are in a sense an introduction and a primer to a continuing series of conferences, which will even be larger in scope and in audience, with great distinguished experts from all over the world, connecting from all over the world, to take place later this summer and throughout the fall on what we will see is a vitally important topic for the very future of humankind and human civilization. So, Dr. Naader, would you give us a vision of where this conference is to go?
Thank you, President Hagelin, and thank you, panelists, esteemed panelists, and those who are attending this conference, which is really vital. When we speak about consciousness, we wonder what is the purpose of discussing such a topic? Is it theoretical? Is it a question of analysis of philosophy, or kind of existential discussion, or is it something that has an importance in our life as individuals and society? And of course, the reason why we are here is not to discuss philosophy, because even the title says the role of consciousness in solving the world problems. So we want to be looking at very real effects, importance, and dynamics of consciousness, in understanding the role that something as abstract as consciousness can play in our lives, not only to solve problems, but actually to allow us to live life and experience it. So we'll be going from very basic principles and ideas to lay the foundation into potentially very complex thinking and discussions in different fields. So first, let us define, for those who are having translations in particular, the term consciousness in terms of awareness. In the Latin terms, consciousness and conscience are using the same word. So conscience is that which deals with morality and action in accordance with law and proper behavior, good and bad. Consciousness, the way we are discussing it, although it can be connected and related to all aspects of life, including conscience, consciousness is the ability to be aware, to be conscious, to be ability to experience, to make a decision, to understand our world, to understand ourselves, and also the ability to feel. So when we feel love, it is our awareness that is colored by certain aspects that we call love, or when we feel pity or compassion, or we feel pain, we are experiencing something that we call pain. And that is what we are talking about. We are talking about that consciousness which allows us to experience reality from this perspective of ability to know, ability to plan, ability to understand the universe that is around us. So consciousness, what is it? Where does it come from? Let us first, again, realize the importance of consciousness in terms of what happens when we don't have consciousness. If we don't have consciousness, we are not aware of anything. We cannot plan anything. We are not able to experience life. We are not able to dream. We are not able to fathom the laws of nature. We are not able to relate to others. And that's a very, very simple reality that we experience, even for those who have been through surgery. For example, in anesthesia, there is the absence of a high state of consciousness. And as you will see, as we will discuss, there is still some level of consciousness in the body, but the higher consciousness is not there. And this is just as an example of what happens in the absence of higher states of consciousness, which is, in this case, waking state. So we live our lives through consciousness. And one can say that life has no meaning without consciousness. We cannot give it a meaning. We cannot experience it. We cannot see growth or progress or wealth or happiness if we don't have consciousness. So in that sense, consciousness is like the screen on which the movie of life unfolds. And that is one aspect of consciousness. Usually in the definitions of consciousness, oftentimes it is thought that consciousness is just like a screen, and on that screen, the movie of life happens. This is, of course, part of consciousness, and it is truly a fundamental part of consciousness. But what we will be discussing and analyzing is that actually the movie itself is a process within consciousness. So consciousness is not just a bystander, kind of a screen on which things are projected, because we can say, okay, life unfolds, it's something that happens, and then I happen to have a screen in my nervous system, my awareness, and that screen allows me to see the movie. Without the screen, obviously, I cannot see the movie. But the screen's absence does not mean the movie is not unfolding. That is the usual understanding. What we will see and discuss in the paradigm that we will present as one possibility, one great assumption about consciousness, is that actually even the movie of life is a play within consciousness. So how this happens, we will get into that in greater detail. But let us keep our mind open to this possibility that actually consciousness is more than a screen. It's also the computer, it's also the projector, it's also what leads to the display and the actual unfoldment of the story of life, of the movie of life, which takes us to something very, very profound, and therefore can have very, very deep implications in how we live our life and how we can change the course of our life, not just experience it, but also the ability to unfold it and direct it in a direction that can be evolutionary and that can bring us happiness and fullness in our life. So this is one thing very important to keep in mind. The other issue is consciousness, or I won't call it issue, the other consideration in consciousness that comes to the front of the discussions is, what is its origin? Where does it come from? In the early 17th century, Descartes defined its Cartesian view that we have a reality which is mental, and we have a reality which is physical, material. So the body and the mind. And consciousness is being considered as part of the mind, and as if the body was something different. So there are two realities, and this is what people usually address or think of as the dualistic perspective. So there are two values, the value of the spiritual, the mental, consciousness, and the value of the material, the physical, the energy value, that are as if two different things, but nobody really was able to figure out how they work together. That is the dualistic perspective. The other perspective is that there is either matter as primary and important, or the mental, the physical as primary and important, and they are one or the other, not that the two exist together. They are one or the other, which means if you take the material perspective, the physical material perspective, we're saying that there is matter that emerges from the physical universe and all the studies that we will hear about in physics. And then ultimately this matter gets organized in a more and more complex and more orderly fashion. And as it gets more and more evolving and organized, it leads to a nervous system, such as in the human beings. And that nervous system then has consciousness. It has consciousness. This is what we call the emergent quality or the emergent aspect of what consciousness is. It's something that is assumed not to exist in matter as such, but that it actually, through evolution and complexification and orderliness, somehow consciousness arises. And therefore, then we get consciousness in the higher evolution of the species, of humans, etc. And this has been, after the focus on the material, on the physical value, has been concepts that have been held very strongly by scientists and philosophers also. And that led to many conclusions, important conclusions, some of which include the fact that maybe only humans have consciousness. And actually there was that very definite understanding and belief that it's only humans who have consciousness, that animals, for example, don't have consciousness, let alone, of course, plants and mineral life that are kind of course, from this perspective, have no consciousness whatsoever. And so that leads to a relationship with the environment, a relationship with life, a relationship with nature that is based on this, again, kind of hierarchy of importance in which, of course, the higher, more evolved nervous system that has consciousness is precious and important, whereas the other aspects of life that are animal and plant life and even mineral, earth and all of that are lesser importance, and they are all just to the service of the higher consciousness in individuals. So this is one kind of monistic perspective, which means there is only energy and matter and material valve that lead to ultimately an emergent quality, which is consciousness. Now, the other aspect of this monistic, if you like, which is one value rather than dualistic, is the idea that actually consciousness is all there is, and consciousness is primary, and consciousness is what actually becomes or appears as matter. The problem with this vision is that how is it possible? How is it possible that something that is abstract, that is not physical, that is not material, can actually appear as matter? And the usual solutions that are given to this kind of what is called panpsychism is that everything else is an illusion. It means you're living in an illusionary reality, and that the physical actually doesn't exist at all. It's just all an imagination, and you are in like a movie, which is not real. It's like you're in a dream, and in that dream you are experiencing things, but they are not real, they are not there. And therefore, of course, this panpsychic theory has been rejected by most scientists in that sense, because there is no explanation of how this can lead to the experiences that we have. That is another thing that we want to discuss, and that will be the elaboration of how actually it's possible that the reality of monistic panpsychic reality of consciousness not just being primary but being the only thing can itself appear as our universe and allow us to experience the tables, the stars, the planets, the flowers, the people, and their lives and their emotions and their feelings in very specific level. Before we get to that, I want to raise another problem of great discussion in the field of consciousness, and that is whether consciousness is primary or whether the material value is primary or not. The scientists who believed in the physical, material, evolution, and emergent quality, they have been trying to explain how is it possible, if we take the material perspective, the physical perspective, how is it possible that this emergent quality happens? And how is it possible that we can experience things? And one philosopher, David Chalmers, has coined something that has become very much used in the discussions on consciousness, and that is what he called the easy problem and the hard problem of consciousness. He says that, of course, we have a nervous system, and if we experience reality through our nervous system, and the proof is if you damage the nervous system, your ability to experience changes, so therefore it's the nervous system that creates the experience and allows the experience to happen. You're damaging your screen, and then you can't see the movie, or you can see only a poor quality of movie. So then, based on this logic that everything comes mainly from the physical, from the material, then how does it happen? Now, there is an easy problem, and how does it happen? The easy problem is to say, for example, the light comes through the retina sends the message through an electrical impulse and through synapses and neurotransmitters to a certain part in the thalamus, and then it goes to the back of the brain, the occipital lobe, and then it gets dissected there, it gets connected to other parts of the nervous system, connected to memory, connected to all the previous experiences, and then this is how we can say, I see the flower, because we can trace the dynamics of what happens from the point of light hitting the retina of the eye all the way to what happens in the nervous system, which neurotransmitters are being involved, how they connect together to create that experience of the flower, or to project, if you like, that part of the movie, which is a flower, that image, on that screen of consciousness. That is called the easy problem, because one day we are going to be able, according to what we predict, to discover what happens in those dynamics. This easy problem is by itself extremely, extremely difficult. We are very far yet from fully understanding it, but science is making step-and-step headways towards it. The problem of how do we actually experience awareness of the object on a subjective level, on a personal subjective level, and know that we are experiencing a flower, know that we are having experience of something that has meaning, that has dimension, that has history, that has feelings, that brings us emotions, or that causes us whatever, either joy or, in other cases, experience of pain, experience of the redness of the red, etc. This is what they call qualia, or individual experiences that are beyond the actual mechanics of the transmission of the connectedness and the dynamics of how the nervous system reacts to a sensory experience. And therefore, until today, even though there are theories about quantum mechanical changes that can happen, and maybe that's what's being experienced as consciousness, until today, we don't have even the slightest hint about how this new reality happens. And that is why it is called the hard problem of consciousness. that is still being studied. There are many theories coming up, but they are still very far from the reality of how to solve it. What we have, on the other hand, is another kind of hard problem. If we take the idea that consciousness is primary, then how is it possible that consciousness can appear as matter? So rather than having the hard problem of how matter creates consciousness, now we have the hard problem, and appears as if much harder, of how consciousness itself, if it is primary, if there is something called consciousness, how does this primary, non-material, non-physical reality, how can it actually create the world as we know it? And for this, we have to have something which is very important to realize, and we have to set it up from the beginning of our seminar, and that is that our perception of reality is what it is, our perception of reality based on the instrument that we have, which is our nervous system, and which limits the capacity to see the full reality. Until now, this has never been questioned. We have many examples of how our sensory apparatus can cheat on us. For example, we use the example, if the sun goes up in the east and goes in the west, and we depend on our sensory apparatus, we say the sun is rising in the east and moving in the sky and then going to the west, and the earth is flat and it doesn't move. And so for millennia and centuries, this is the belief, because that is what our senses tell us. But then we realize there is a different reality, that as we look at it from a different perspective, then we have a different understanding, and we find that the earth rotates around its axis, creating the movement, apparent movement of the sun around the earth for the day and the night, and also the seasons. Now, giving even more, and this our panelists and Dr. Hegel in particular can comment on that, giving some problems that scientists, as they went deep into nature and analyzed the smaller parts of nature, they discovered phenomena that are unexplainable until there were theories such as Einstein's theory to explain that even time and space, which look very rigid for us, are actually relative, and they depend on the speed at which you go. Now, this kind of discussion we might have, we'll see if our great moderator, President Hegel, will want to discuss these as we go along, but the hard and fast reality of particles, of objects being separate from each other, and being just solid entities as we see them, and the distances between them and the time that goes between them that we see on a classical level in a certain way, they fall apart and they are not sustainable when we go to a different layer and level of nature. Now, this is just to tell us that our assumptions about reality depends on our perception and sometimes our preconceived ideas, and how our nervous system has been able to fathom the realities of life. That is going to be a very important aspect in the ability to understand how from one consciousness manifesting itself in its ability to be conscious, and this is where we come to this very important point of our paradigm, and that is we're going to say there is a paradigm of consciousness not only being primary, but being everything, and that consciousness is non-material, yet its nature is to be conscious. And as its nature is to be conscious, we find now kind of two different values. The value of pure consciousness, which is just something that is unbounded, infinite, not within the context of speed or time or limitations of space, and therefore it transcends, it goes beyond all these considerations. It is infinite, yet it is a point at the same time. It is unbounded, yet it can be seen as being present here and now all the time, into something that we are calling to be conscious. So that will be two realities in a sense, the pure being, pure consciousness beyond space-time, and then to be conscious, which opens the door of manifestation, because to be conscious requires three values: the observer, the one who is conscious, the object of observation, the object that is being perceived as the object of consciousness, and the dynamics that connect the observer to the observed, which is the process of knowing. This knowledge has come to us in a grand way from His Holiness Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, from the ancient Vedic tradition, that has been the experts in consciousness. In modern times, we have the study of the physical, the objective universe. In the ancient times, it was the study of awareness. They were introspecting, going within themselves and studying the dynamics of their own awareness. And that comes from the very ancient tradition of yoga and meditation, and transcendental meditation in particular. It was brought by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who himself saw that the ancient knowledge was based on three aspects, which he called in Sanskrit, they are defined, Rishi, Devata, and Chandas. And these three values he described as the knower, the knowing, and the object of knowledge. So the process that connects the subject to the object. And in this dynamic of being conscious, to become conscious, there is three values that emerge: the silent value of the observer, the dynamic value that allows the connectedness between the observer and the object, and the object itself, which is the object of observation. Now, of course, we can say if there is one consciousness, then who is the observer? It's the one consciousness. What are the dynamics? It's the one consciousness. What is the object of observation? It is the one consciousness. Yet these three flavors arise, and as these three flavors arise, they interact with each other also, because now there is a quality, there is a perception of a difference. It was one and the same, but now we are saying, I am conscious, so where is the observer, process, and observing? And then the dynamics that interact, allow those to interact one with the other, give different perspectives. And that is a very important point that we have to keep in mind also, and the dynamics of how consciousness becomes multiplicity. And that is a question of perspective. Your perspective, you have the same landscape, you can look at it from the right, from the left, from the top, from the bottom, and that gives you different perspectives. So you can look at it from the perspective of silent seer, from a perspective of dynamic process, or from the perspective of a hiding object, which actually is the object that becomes the dynamic, the predominant aspect of the experience. So we can go through all of this further, but let us say this. In conclusion, what we are presenting and highlighting is that consciousness is primary, not only primary as something that then changes and creates something outside itself, but in the dynamics of consciousness, looking at itself from different perspectives, emerge the field of diversity. And in that field of diversity, there is the potential for different perceptions, different perspectives, and these perspectives are what are the basis of multiplicity. So there is a way to explain how consciousness, the one consciousness, can lead to multiplicity. And in this multiplicity, you will have small consciousness, big consciousness, enormous consciousness, huge consciousness, full consciousness. And that is another point we want to keep in mind, is that consciousness is not just a unitary value. At one, either it is there or it's not. And we know this because we have different states of consciousness. Maybe Dr. Travis will elaborate on that from his knowledge and research. Sleep, waking, dreaming are different states of consciousness that have physiological correspondence. But we also have higher states of consciousness that people are experiencing through the practice of transcendental meditation. And that lead to very, very profound and important changes in life and personal understanding, and in the quality of experience and the ability to grow and evolve and be productive and creative in one's life. So there is a range of consciousness, and this consciousness extends itself to the animal life, to the life of plants, and even to the mineral life. So how can this be? We are going to define consciousness in a new way, and that way is anything that is felt, detected, that interacts with anything else, we are going to call consciousness. And so we do not want to say that consciousness is always a human kind of consciousness. Human kind of consciousness is evolved consciousness, and even within humankind there are different states, but even lower consciousness exists, and this lower consciousness is in animals. Even lower consciousness is in plants, but it is consciousness. If the plant feels the heat, feels the sun, the molecules in it detect it, they interact with each other, they react together, the plants and their roots, how they work together, and there are many examples of much more complex reality of the plant life than we ever imagined. We are going to call this consciousness. It is not like our consciousness as humans. The plant might not have self-awareness, which probably it doesn't. The plant might not feel pain. The plant might not feel different things that we feel, yet it feels certain things, and whatever it feels, we're going to say this is a lower consciousness. In the mineral life, even feeling gravity, we're saying feeling gravity or responding to gravity is going to be considered as part of a very elementary, very small amount of consciousness. So we're not saying that when the stone falls to the ground under the force of gravity, it is afraid what's going to happen to me, I'm going to break myself, I'm going to be hurting. It has absolutely no awareness of this kind whatsoever, yet just the fact that it responds to gravity, we're going to call this a tiny little, very elementary, basic level of consciousness. So we are expanding consciousness from a human consciousness, higher states of consciousness, to lower states of consciousness and tiny states of consciousness. And that has relevance to how we deal with our life, how we deal with our environment, and how we can manage the individual consciousness and what we will be calling the collective consciousness, and the importance of this for our own personal life and for the life of our societies, with very, very specific research that has been done on transcendental meditation and the advanced techniques and other programs from Vedic science that show the importance of consciousness in all these areas and its importance in solving the problems of life. President Heglen, I took a long time. I promise it will be the last time I do that. But the subject is wide, and I wanted to put a logic that is a little bit more complete than just saying things that will leave the listeners wondering what is going on. But thank you for your patience.
Oh,